Hello and welcome to the Westerville Public Library's Book Hook series, where we read the first chapter of a book to introduce you to new works and authors. Today, with permission from and thanks to Simon Schuster Publishing, we're diving into the first book of the popular Richard Drury series by Martha Grimes, The Man with a Load of Mischief. In this humorous but suspenseful mystery set in modern-day England, you'll meet Inspector Drury as he tracks down a murderer amidst colorful local characters and costumes. So grab a cozy blanket, dim the lights, and enjoy the story. The Man with a Load of Mischief by Martha Grimes. Chapter 1. Saturday, December 19th. Outside the Jack and Hammer, a dog growled. Inside, his view of the high street obstructed by the window at his shoulder, Melrose Plant sat in the curve of the bay, drinking Old Peculiar and reading Rimbaud. The dog growled deep in its throat and started barking again, something it had been doing intermittently for the last 15 minutes. Sun streaming through the cerulean blue and deep green of the tulip design of the leaded panes threw rainbow colors across his table as Melrose Plant rose up to peer over the reverse letters advertising Hardy's Crown. The dog sitting in the snow outside the public house was a scruffy Jack Russell, belonging to Miss Crisp, who ran the second-hand furniture shop across the street. Usually, it launched its bark from a chair set outside her door. Today, however, it had wandered across the street to occupy itself with the Jack and Hammer's frontage. It barked on. "I direct your attention, Dick," said Melrose Plant, "to the curious incident of the dog in the daytime." Across the room, Dick Scroggs, the publican, paused in his polishing of the beveled mare behind the bar. "What's that, my lord?" "Nothing," said Melrose Plant, "just paraphrasing Sir Arthur." "Sir Arthur, my lord?" "Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, you know." Melrose took a swig of his ale and went back to Rimbaud, but he didn't get very far along before the dog started barking again. "Actually," said Melrose, snapping the book shut, "I believe it was the dog in the nighttime." Scroggs applied the cloth to the mirror. "Nighttime, daytime, I only wish the bleedin' dog'd stop it. He'd be driving me crazy. Ain't it enough me nerves are in a state with the murder over at Matchett's place?" Dick was, for all his height and girth, a very nervous individual. Long Pendleton's murder had him constantly looking over his shoulder and regarding any stranger who walked into the Jack and Hammer with suspicion. It was the murder, Melrose supposed, that had put him in mind of Conan Doyle. Murder, in fact, was not nearly so intriguing as murder in fancy. But he did have to admit their own murder had a certain flair. The head of the victim had been shoved down in a keg of beer. The dog still barked. It was not the sort of bark one hears when dogs greet each other over fences, nor was it especially loud. It was merely maddeningly persistent, as if this particular dog had chosen this post outside the Jack and Hammer's window to stand sentry and deliver its canine message to the world. Dick Scroggs threw down his bar towel and went to the row of casement windows just beyond Plant's table, fronting the high street. Scroggs wound out one of them, and a blur of snow flew in around the corners. He shouted at the barking animal, "I be out there to kick your scruffy bleedin' head off. Just see if I don't." "How awfully un-English of you, Dick," said Plant, adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles over his fine nose and returning to Rimbaud. It was his 40th birthday present to himself, an early edition of Les Illuminations, for which he had paid a ridiculous price, telling himself he deserved it, then wondering why. But Scroggs' shouts had only exacerbated the barking, since the dog now thought it had got some attention and meant to keep it. Dick Scroggs threw open the door and went outside to show the dog he meant business. Plant had managed to read partway through Enfants when he heard Scroggs gasp, "My God, my lord, come quick!" Plant looked up to see the publican's head framed in the snowy window. The face was gray and ghastly, a blown-up version of the gargoyle heads beneath the beam outside, which gave the ancient building a quaint ecclesiastical air. Plant made for the door. Outside, he plowed through ankle-deep snow to where Dick Scroggs and the small brown Jack Russell stood side by side, looking upward. "Good God," whispered Melrose Plant, as the clock chimed the noon hour and another clump of snow fell from the figure atop the wooden beam that jutted out over the walk. The figure was not the mechanical smith usually located there, whose hammer was simulated strikes at a forge. "It's that Mr. Ainsley that come in last night, my lord. For a room, he did." Scroggs' voice cracked hoarsely. How long's he been up there, I wonder? Melrose Plant, ordinarily a man of extreme self-possession, was not sure how his own voice would sound. He cleared his throat. Hard to tell. Could have been up there for hours. All night, perhaps. And no one's seen him? 20 feet overhead and shrouded in snow deck. As he spoke, another chunk fell, molten in the sun, plop, at their feet. I suggest one of us trot along to the station and get Constable Pluck. But it wasn't necessary. The barking of the dog and Plants and Scrogg's attendance at this macabre affair seemed to have waked the high street from its snowy sleep, and people were appearing out of shops, in windows, down walks and alleyways. Melrose saw that Constable Pluck had appeared outside the station up the street and was dragging on his dark blue overcoat. And here was the missus, said Dick with a hoarse whisper, wondering if he'd be wanting a bit of breakfast. Said Melrose Plant, polishing the lenses of his spectacles. I'd say it makes no odds to it, Mr. Ainsley. The Jack and Hammer was wedged between Trueblood's Antiques and a haberdasher sensibly called The Shop, which only changed its window display of bits and pieces of threads, tea cozies, mittens, dribs, and drabs of dry goods at Christmas and Easter. Across the street were a small garage with one bay, Jervis, the butcher shop, a dark little cycle shop, and Miss Crisp's. Farther along, just before the bridge that spanned the Piddle River, was Long Piddleton's police station. The pub had once been painted a rather distinct ultramarine, but its most unusual feature was the structure attached to its front and from which it derived its name. Standing atop a sturdy beam was a mechanical smith, carved out of wood and holding a copy of a 17th century forge hammer. When the large clock beneath the beam told the hours, Jack would raise his hammer and strike away at the invisible iron forge. The beam was 20 feet off the ground, about 7 feet long and 2 feet in girth, and it jutted over the walk below. The carved figure, now removed from the beam, although not life-size, was not far from it. Originally, he had been painted into a bright blue coat and aquamarine trousers, but the paint was dull now, chipped and peeling. Jack was a favorable butt of jokes and horseplay, especially among the village children, who sometimes dressed him up and sometimes took him down. The wooden figure was treated very much like a rugby trophy, something to be carted away by delinquent boys from the nearby market town of Sidbury, and later rescued by equally delinquent boys from Long Piddleton. It was, in a way, the town mascot. Just this past Guy Fawkes Day, several children had sneaked into the pub while Dick and his missus were fast asleep. They had gone up the back stairs and into the box room just above the beam outside, and they had lifted Jack from his supporting pole, from which he had been loosened by much tomfoolery over the years, and carried him off to the graveyard of St. Rule's Church and buried him. Poor Jack, Mrs. Withersby had lamented from her post by the Jack and Hammer's fire. Not even a Christian burial, buried at the dog's side he were, not even in confiscated ground. Bad luck it'll be all around, mark me. Poor Jack. Since Mrs. Withersby's oracular powers were somewhat diminished by gin, not many people listened, but bad luck it was. Just one night before the discovery of Mr. Ainsley's body, another body had been found in an inn less than 1 mile from Long Piddleton's High Street, the body of one William Small, Esquire. With word that a killer was on the loose, the villagers were sticking to their parlors and fireplaces, something they might have done in any case because of the snow. It had been snowing for 2 days all over Northamptonshire. All over north of England, indeed. Lovely soft stuff, which mounted on roofs and settled in corners of windows, and whose leaded panes were turned to squares of gold and ruby by reflected firelight. With the snow coming down and the smoke rising up from the chimney pots, Long Piddleton looked like a Christmas card of itself, despite the recent murder. On the morning of December 19th, the snow had finally stopped, and a bright sun had come out and melted enough of it so that the cottages could be seen prettily, even lavishly painted. The high street, down to the bridge, was fascinating, or beguiling, or weird, depending upon one's tastes. It looked like it had been done by a convention of crazy house painters. Perhaps bored with the usual limestone, in this limestone belt of Northamptonshire, they had gone rioting with ice cream parlor callers, a hint of strawberry here, of lemon there, and farther on, a glimmer of pistachio, and then a sudden splash of emerald. When the sun was at its highest, the street fairly glittered. Sunlight dyed the russet bridge at the end so deep it was almost mahogany. To a child, it must have been like walking between big gumdrops down to the chocolate bridge. An odd place for one murder to occur, much less two. If you could just tell me what happened, sir, the circumstances in which the body was found, said Superintendent Charles Pratt of the Northamptonshire Constabulary, who had been in Long Piddleton just yesterday. Melrose Plant explained, while Constable Pluck stood by eagerly taking notes. Pluck was thin to the point of emaciation, but he had a cherubic rosy face, made even rosier by winter's bite, so that he looked like an apple on a stick. But he was a good man, if a bit of a gossip. And you say, so far as you know, this Ainsley chap was a stranger hereabouts, like the other. Pratt consulted his own notebook, then slapped it shut. William Small. As far as I know, yes, said Melrose Plant. Superintendent Pratt cocked his head and looked at Plant out of mild blue eyes that seemed innocent, but that were, Melrose was sure, anything but. Then you've reason to believe these men weren't strangers, sir. Melrose raised an eyebrow. Well, naturally, Superintendent. Haven't you? I'll have a whiskey, Dick. Neat, if you please. Pratt having left and taken his lab crew, Melrose, Plant, and Dick Scroggs were alone once more in the Jack and Hammer. And have one yourself, Dick. Don't mind if I do, said Dick Scroggs. It's a right old mess, isn't it? Several hours had elapsed, but Dick was still white, having watched closely the examination by the pathologist and the removal of the body, wrapped in a polyethylene sheet. The superintendent had left Pluck to see to the sealing off and the victim's room. There, they had been shocked to discover the murderer had added the further grotesque touch of placing the mechanical figure Jack in the victim's bed. It was no wonder that Dick Scroggs was still trembly as he plucked up the 50-pence piece Melrose Plant had dropped on the bar. They studied their glasses for a moment, each alone with his own thoughts. Alone, that is, except for Mrs. Withersby, one of the many whom Pratt had questioned, who charged for Scroggs sometimes to get her drinking money. At that moment she was sitting on her favorite stool, spitting into the fire that had not been extinguished in 100 years. Now, seeing that the hard stuff was exchanging hands, she hove herself up from her stool and shuffled over, carpet slippers slapping the floor. Cigarette butt and spittle vied for position in the corner of her mouth. She removed the one between thumb and finger and wiped the other with the back of her wrist. She said, or shouted rather, "His lordship buyin'?" Dick raised a questioning eyebrow at Melrose Plant. "Certainly," said Melrose, placing a pound note on the bar. "Nothing is too good for the woman with whom I danced all night in Brighton." Dick was setting up a half-pint when Mrs. Withersby changed her tune. "Gin! I'll have me a gin, not that cat-lap." Then down she sat at the bar beside her benefactor, her faded yellowish hair standing up all around her head like a fright wig. She watched closely for her full measure as Dick poured. "If you'd add a pinch of dried mole's body to that there gin, wouldn't none of us have the ague?" "Mole's body?" wondered Plant, taking out his slim golden cigarette case and extracting a cigarette. "Or maybe it was that malaria fever. Me mum always kept a bit of dried mole about. Drinking it in gin 9 mornings running, and you'd be fit as a fiddle." Or under the table, thought Melrose, offering his case to Mrs. Withersby. "And did you answer Superintendent Pratt's questions truthfully, madam?" Her arthritic fingers grabbed up 2 of the cigarettes, one of which she planted in her mouth, the other in her checkered gingham dress pocket. "Truthful? Of course I answered truthful," she said in a falsetto whine. "It's more'n I can say for the Fairy of the Glen next door." She hooked her thumb in the direction of Trueblood's Antiques. The sexual persuasion of its proprietor had long been under discussion in the village. "Don't go casting irresponsible aspersions about now," said Plant, who had just purchased the cure for ague and malaria. She now raised her warty lips. He lit her cigarette for her and was rewarded with a stream of smoke blown in his face. Then she leaned closer, her tobacco, beer, gin breath roiling over him like a sea fret. "Now we got this crazed murderer running about, doin' in us innercent folk," she snorted. "Only this ain't no human hand. It's the divil's hand himself, mark me. I knew there'd be a death the day that bird fell down your chimbley, Dick Scroggs, and we ain't had no watchin' at the porch at St. Mark's Eve for 5 years. The dead will walk, mark my words. The dead will walk." She nearly fell off her stool in her excitement, and Melrose thought the dead might be walking past them right now. But she quieted down when she regarded her now empty glass, which no one was paying any attention to. Slyly she said, "And how's your dear auntie, my lord? Generous to a fault, isn't she? Always buys me a drink, friendly like." Melrose signaled to Scroggs to refill the glass. Having secured her gin, she went on. "Lives simple like, not giving herself airs, and comes round every year with them Christmas baskets, for which Melrose paid. and she continued to extol his aunt's virtues. Melrose studied the reflections in the mirror and wondered which was the toad and which was the fairy princess. He was about to tuck into his pickled egg when Dick broke into a fit of violent coughing, for which Mrs. Withersby had her remedy ready. Tell your missus to fix up a bit of roast mouse. Me mum always had a bit of roast mouse for the whooping cough. Melrose looked at the egg lolling on the plate and decided he wasn't so hungry after all. He paid up his bill, their bill, and bade farewell politely to Mrs. Withersby, Long Piddleton's village apothecary, village drunk, and village oracle. I hope you enjoyed the first chapter of The Man with a Load of Mischief by Martha Grimes. Want more? Check out the book, ebook, or audiobook from the Westerville Public Library and find out what happens next. Need help getting the book? Just call the Westerville Public Library at 614-882-7277 at extension 4.